recording in progress. And we will see if we can institute screen sharing without bringing everything to a crashing halt. That's what he said. It's wonderful. All right, and let's go through the usual liturgy here. You see the collect. Do you now see the Rotary Club?
Yeah.
Okay. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant so to hear them, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them. We may embrace and ever hold fast the blessed hope of everlasting life, which you have given us in our Savior, Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. Before we get to the Rotary Club, does anyone have anything, any questions, any comments, any thoughts?
Richard, we're about halfway through Revelations, and I wonder why it was included in the New Testament, and I wonder what Christians at the time made of this book.
Well, as with much of ancient literature, we have to go more by guess and by golly than by what we actually know, so that if you look at some of the earliest use of the Bible, and so let's get away from this is in the days before people had an idea that there was a New Testament, but when there were just documents, books that people used in church, there were what we use to kind of figure out how important a book was to the early church is how it is used. So if we have an early author like Irenaeus of Lyon, or Clement of Rome, or blanking on his name, but a guy from Alexandria who is Origen from Alexandria, people will look and say, well, which books out of the Bible do they quote? And one of the things about the Revelation to John is it is not quoted as much as some of the other books, which gives the idea that it was perhaps not accepted as much. And there might have been a matter of debate as to whether, when they began to think of what books are the ones we will call canonical, official, will the Revelation to John come in? And as scholars talk about this, and of course you get the idea that, scholars have a kind of general accepted view that they tend to hold, and people will believe different things, but you fall down into one camp. So they talk as though there are things that we know that we may not really know, but we have been able to infer. And so when it comes to the New Testament, there seems to have been general acceptance of most of the books we have. But two books that almost didn't make it into it were one, the letter to the Hebrews, because it doesn't list an author. You know, all of Paul's letters, even the ones that probably weren't written by Paul, but by a disciple in another generation, begin with, I, Paul. This is from Paul. Hebrews doesn't list an author. And for years, I mean, in the King James Bible, you could see the letter of Paul to the Hebrews, but there are all sorts of differences in that. So since it did not have an apostolic author, it almost didn't get in. And the Revelation to John almost didn't get in because it was too wild. But for whatever reason, perhaps because it has that ascription of an author named John, and the church assumed that that was the beloved apostle, it got brought in. But it has been a part of the New Testament for as long as we remember. There were books that almost made it in. I frequently talk about The Shepherd of Hermas, which was very popular in the early church because it talked about what heaven looked like. Rolling green hills, if you want to know. Think golf course without the holes in the flags. You know, people wanted to know. So there's all sorts of talk now, and you get this from like a scholarly work like the Da Vinci Code, that there was some plot out there to exclude some books and only bring in others, when it was probably more a sense of what the churches were using, and sort of a body of literature that was accepted sort of across the board. So, anything else?
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. We're gonna get into some things today about the fornication, the idolatry, the worship of false gods. And I want to go back to something we talked about in the when we were dealing with early on the letters to the 7 churches. And that was the prevalence of Roman and Greek and other local religions in the society. So you had a variety of guilds in the Roman Empire. They were called collegia, where we get college from. And the guilds were a lot like the Rotary Club. You know, people joined Rotary, people joined Kiwanis, people joined Civitan in order to meet other people, in order to make business contacts. And there's a lot that goes on in these groups that has to do with how everything functions. So that there was a time when someone who was not a member of the country club might be excluded from certain important discussions about local government or business because they weren't able to stand out on the golf course with the county commission, sort of thing.
Richard?
Yes?
Richard, have you moved on beyond the colic?
Yes, I have. We're back up against that again. Okay. Let's
You said
see
Rotary,
if
so I was looking for the Rotary Club.
Kathy, you're just so much trouble.
Thank you. I try.
Yeah. I will stop sharing.
Now I'm there. Now, no, you're there now.
All right. Are you seeing the Rotary Club now?
We did until you stopped sharing. So now we see the colic.
Okay. Have we moved on?
No, you still, now you have.
Okay. Now we've moved on. You are screen sharing now. Okay. Well, there's the Rotary Club. The guilds filled, we're somewhere between a trade union and the Rotary Club, and they involved the local gods and goddesses. So let's say that you are a maker of baskets, or you are a potter. The goddess Minerva might be the patroness of your guild. If you were an importer or ran a shop, Mercury, the god of trade, might be the patron of your guild. So let's say you're going to your Rotary lunch, that a part of the Rotary lunch either takes place at the Temple of Mercury, where you offer a goat in sacrifice that is then served up for lunch. What is probably more likely is that the president, the chair, whoever, the head of the food committee, would go to the Temple of Minerva and have a sacrifice done for the local Rotary Club so that they could have fresh goat for their lunch. And animal sacrifice, was not just a matter of giving the meat to the god. There was most often a meal associated that, where you would participate in the sacrifice by cooking and eating the meat of the sacrifice, or a part of it. So the worship of the pagan gods was really an important part of this. They also had burial societies, where there were guilds that met specifically to take care of the burial of the members. I don't know if you're familiar with the custom of putting pennies on a dead person's eyes before they were buried. The idea there was that was the payment to Charon, the ferryman of the underworld, to be sure that you got safely across. And there were also religious societies, sodalities, where and these were not just religious, but they were also social. I have been in towns where there's, say, more than one Episcopal church, where all the doctors went to one church. In my last church, I had a doctor who came to my church because all the other doctors went to the other church, and he didn't want to he said, I hang around with them all week. Why would I want to go to church with them? So, but these societies, these religious things, had a strong social, political, and business-oriented connotation that would make, if you were an outsider and couldn't take part in it, it would be hard for you to be successful at business, successful in local politics. You would brand yourself as an outsider by taking part in it. Okay. Just remember that has been in the background all through the book. So here we go. I saw another angel. Remember, we had the angel last week. With an eternal gospel. He's flying in mid-heaven, and the eternal gospel to every nation, tribe, and language and people, said in a loud voice, we've got these loud voices, fear God and give him glory, for the hour of his judgment has come, and worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea, and the springs of water. Okay, we'll look at this first. We're going to have more than 3 angels, but we get 3 angels and then a little change. And I think there may be a reflection of, we've just had three evil things: the dragon, another beast, and a beast. And so we're seeing three good things following that. He's up in mid-heaven, and that means he's, like up right above us. What he's doing can be seen and heard by everybody with ears to hear. We've heard of the mid-heaven before. Back in chapter 8, there was an eagle flying in mid-heaven who is crying out woes to the inhabitants of the earth about the trumpet blast that three angels are about to blow. These are three angels proclaiming, but you get these echoes of ideas. The idea of proclaiming the eternal gospel, in the Greek, it basically says evangelize the evangel. The word for proclaiming the gospel is basically a verbal form of euangelion, good news, the Greek. So we are gospeling the gospel. And it is here a universal gospel to every nation and tribe and language and people. And we can go back to the Acts of the Apostles and the day of Pentecost, where people from all nations heard the gospel in their own language. The hour of his judgment has come, and we've been hearing this in one form or another for the last few weeks, that this is the moment, this is the time. And if you look back in John, the Gospel, chapter 12, and this seems to be kind of central for the Revelation in some ways. Now is the judgment of this world. Now the ruler of this world will be driven out. And I, when I am lifted up, will draw all the earth to myself. Let's see. Okay. The setting for that thing in the Gospel of John is some Greeks who are visiting Jerusalem come up to Philip and they say, "We would see Jesus." And at that point, there's a voice that speaks from heaven to Jesus. And Jesus then says, "Now is the judgment of this world." And it seems to be that, at least for the Gospel of John, the proclaiming of the gospel to the whole world, every family, language, people, and nation, is the moment that begins judgment. And when I am lifted up from the earth, when he's on the cross, is the glorification and the triumph of God. The hour of judgment has come. And then this thing of making heaven and earth seas and the springs of water. Go back to Exodus. In 6 days, the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them. That's just the establishment of the Sabbath. And then in the Acts of the Apostles, we bring you good news that you should turn from these worthless things, pagan worship, to the living God who made heaven and earth and the sea and all that is in them. So this is a standard formula, but in the context of what we've been seeing, where the beast or the dragon stood on the shores of the sea, and there was a beast that came up out of the sea, and we had another beast that came up out of the earth. We're once again emphasizing that while we're seeing these things come out of the earth and the sea, God has dominion over them. Throughout this whole thing, we don't need to worry. God's in control. Okay. And so we move on to the next, another angel. And we keep getting this emphasis of another angel, so we won't think it's the earlier angel coming back. A second angel followed, saying, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has made all the nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. And in the Bible, Babylon is used as a symbol of great power. It is used as a symbol generally of great evil, of great excess. Think of the book of Jonah, where God wants Jonah to go and preach repentance to Babylon. And Jonah is so outraged that God wants to forgive the Babylonians that he gets in a boat and goes in the other direction. Hence the need for the whale, who somehow manages to swim under the Arabian Peninsula and come up in the Red Sea to spit him out on the shore, but we won't go into that. But Babylon is just a symbol. Think of how somebody might today speak of Los Angeles or San Francisco. You know, the old line that America tilts from east to west and everything loose rolls down to California. No offense to California's family there, or my California family, but it's often used as a symbol of the flaky and the extreme and the excess and all of that. That's Babylon. And, you know, in Daniel, the king says, is this not magnificent Babylon? He's on the roof of his palace, which I have built as a royal capital by my mighty power and for my glorious majesty. And while the words were still in the king's mouth, a voice came from heaven. O Nebuchadnezzar, to you is declared, the kingdom is departed from you. You know, Babylon looks big and powerful, and Babylon, you know, in the biblical thought, shares the same root as Babel. And you remember in the Tower of Babel story, when they're building this big tower to heaven to make their name last forever, in the story, God sort of looks down and says, what are they doing down there? Let's go down and see what they're doing. And it's because they think they're so big and powerful, but it's so tiny, God can't see it. So he has to go down and look. But we have images of Babylon falling, Isaiah, fallen is Babylon, and all the images of her gods lie shattered on the ground. This is from early in Isaiah, when Babylon is still a part of the Assyrian Empire. The Babylonians haven't taken over yet, but still a powerful image. And then Jeremiah, who lived while Babylon was the superpower of the Middle East. Babylon was a golden cup in the Lord's hand, making all the earth drunken. The nations drink of her wine, and so the nations went mad. Suddenly Babylon is fallen and shattered. Wail for her. And both of these are sort of hopeful stories of the fall of Babylon, but the idea is, as a symbol, it's really powerful. In Isaiah, you know, the idea of, and we're going to see some more of this in a minute, drinking the wine of the wrath of her fornication. Wine is a symbol of the wrath of God. In Isaiah, I've trodden the winepress alone, and from the peoples no one was with me. I trod them in my anger, trampled them in my wrath. Their juice spattered on my garments and stained all my robes. And then in the Revelation later on, he will tread the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God the Almighty. Look a little more at this in a second. Drunkenness, we get to a third angel. Let's do this first. Another angel, a third, followed them, the first two angels, crying with a loud voice, those who worship the beast and its image and receive a mark on their foreheads or on their hands, they will also drink the wine of God's wrath, poured unmixed into the cup of his anger, and they will be tormented. And we'll get into the torment in a bit. You've made your people see hard things. You have given us wine to drink that made us stagger. For in the hand of the Lord there is a cup with foaming wine, well mixed, and he pours out from it, and all the wicked of the earth shall drain it down to the dregs. The idea that wine is something that hits you hard, and the drinking of it is going to be a symbol of judgment, comes through. And then from Isaiah, wake yourself, stand up, O Jerusalem. You who have drunk from the hand of the Lord the cup of his wrath, who have drunk to the dregs the bowl, the cup of staggering. And I'm going to shift out of biblical stuff for a second. This is from the golden age of Greek theater. There's a story, a play called The Bacchae. And in Greek and Roman, whether it's Bacchus or Dionysius, worship of Bacchus, there was a festival where the women would go out and would assume the character of what were called maenads, who were the female devotees following Bacchus in the stories about him. And they would kind of go wild. And the story in the Bacchae is that this king sneaks out to watch what they're doing. And they catch him, and in the frenzy, in the orge, which is a Greek word for being puffed up, being full, or being angry, they tear him to pieces. We get the word orgy from this, but when the Greeks used it, it had more to do with being out of control. And you get, I think, this sense kind of in the Mediterranean thought that that wine led to being out of control. You are losing something by drinking too much. Okay. You'll notice it says unmixed wine. Now, it's interesting how ideas get into common parlance. Like, for example, people say that in the Middle Ages, they used pepper to hide the flavor of rotten meat. Well, the difficulty with that is pepper pretty much was on par in the Middle Ages for cost with gold. Pepper was a very precious thing. You wouldn't, and rotten meat was not really a problem. They had lots of, meat available, but you wouldn't take gold dust and sprinkle it on your rotten meat to make it look better. Well, there is a thing you hear again and again and again, that people in the ancient world and through the Middle Ages and up through the colonial period drank beer or wine because the water was bad. Well, the difficulty with that is that, at least in the ancient world, you never drank wine that was not mixed with water. You would at the least, somebody who was wanting to have a really wild party would mix the wine and water half and half. Has anybody here ever read the Iliad? Okay. In the Iliad has lots of repeated phrases, and one of them was they mixed the wine and poured out a libation to the deathless gods. So if you were drinking wine in ancient Greece, you would mix the water and wine and then pour out a little slosh on the ground as an offering to the gods. So just think that in general Mediterranean culture, there is this sense, and the Bacchae was probably written about the same time as Jeremiah was hanging around in the Middle East. This idea of God's wrath being in it, and we'll see wine as a symbol of blood. coming up as well. All right. We get down to, they will be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels, in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever. There is no rest day and night for those who worship the beast and its image, and for anyone who receives the mark of its name. And this idea of the punishment that's, and since they're tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb, this is not people going to hell. This is up in heaven. Remember, that's where the Lamb is. That's where the angels are. What is going on here? Well, remember, and again, preaching to the choir. There have been some studies lately of evangelical writings and evangelical meetings. And it seems that a lot of revivals, meetings where people are invited to come and receive Christ, really seem to be more structured as a support for people who are already in the community. And to support them and to encourage them. And here, this picture of those who will be tormented is not so much a something that you're going to write it down and show it to your neighbors so they'll join the church, but it's kind of saying, this is what God's judgment has on hand for the unrighteous. You're going to be suffering as a Christian, but it's only going to be for a time. And so we'll get a line about this in a minute. But there's another aspect to it. This is a picture of Alan Bosak. He wrote a commentary on the Revelation to John back during the days of apartheid in South Africa. And in the beginning of it, he says, you can't gain a full appreciation of the Revelation to John unless you are part of an oppressed community. We are able to stand back and to look at this story and go, sort of, isn't this interesting? And this may be what this means. But Bosak was practicing what's called theology from below, and that is from the human experience, so that people who are under persecution, people who know what it's like to have a government that's working against them, to have the forces of government working against them, will read this with a whole different appreciation. And so the idea of the oppressive forces being judged, and justice being embodied somehow, takes on a different meaning for them. And you've got to remember that while these people under the Revelation were probably not living under active persecution, no one was throwing them to the lions, they were still excluded or living with the choice of being excluded based on how faithful they were to the purity of their own religion, as opposed to cooperating with, participating in the Roman religious system. Again, going back to what we would view as something as simple as the Rotary or Kiwanis Club. And then we get to this line that all of this before, what we've heard from the three angels about now is the hour of judgment, God's in control, and justice is going to be brought upon the evil forces of the world. Here is a call for the endurance of the saints, those who keep the commandments of God and hold fast to the faith of Jesus. And as we've heard in some of the other books we've looked at, this could also be translated as who hold fast to faith in Jesus. But there seems to be in some of the New Testament writing that the faith of Jesus, that God would redeem him, that God would bring him to resurrection, is the same faith that we hold because of Jesus. And so, but it is at this moment that we're getting, Bob was saying we're about halfway through. We're actually a little over halfway through. But this is, if there's a bumper sticker to come out of the Revelation to John, this is it. Here is a call for the endurance of the saints. We're going to be entering a time of trouble, but hold on. Yeah, actually, I got a couple of slides reversed. This idea of holding fast comes up repeatedly in the Revelation. In chapter 2, we had only hold fast to what you have until I come. And in chapter 3, I am coming soon. Hold fast to what you have so that no one may seize your crown. The idea is, that we've heard again and again, that troubling times are coming, but they're not going to last forever. God will redeem. And in AA, they like to say, don't quit before the miracle happens. This word down at the bottom, akidia, it's a Greek word that's not used in the New Testament. It does appear in the early years of the church. It's what gets out of the 7 deadly sins. It's what gets translated as sloth. And we have come to believe that it means being lazy, thanks to our Puritan ancestors. But what originally meant was losing faith in the process. So the monks in the early desert had what they called the devil in the noonday sun. That is, it's the middle of the day, it's hot, you're tired, and you just want to give up. You're getting nowhere in your spiritual life. That's what akidia is. And this idea here is don't give up on the process. Trust that God's in command and everything is going to work out. And then to go back to the next verse, I heard a voice from heaven saying, write this, blessed are the dead who from now on die in the Lord. Yes, says the Spirit, they will rest from their labors, for their deeds follow them. Okay, this gets used in every funeral we do at the beginning. We begin with a series of scriptural things that begins, I am the resurrection and the life, and ends with, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord. Even so, says the Spirit, for they rest from their labors. What this voice is saying, along with the call for endurance, is, yes, people are going to die. There are going to be martyrs. That multitude that no one can number, who have washed their robes in the blood of the Lamb. But don't worry, they're in God's hands too. They will rest from their labor. And if you go back to the Gospel of John, we also have one that we use repeatedly in funeral services. This is probably the most popular gospel for funerals. Do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house there are many places. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, so that where I am, there you may be also. Now, we're so accustomed to using this in funerals that we think that Jesus is talking about us dying. But in reality, at least in the context of the Gospel of John, this is a climactic point of a really long talk that goes back a chapter or more, where Jesus is not preparing for the disciples for their own death. He's preparing the disciples for his death. The mourning and the heart-troubling thing is going to be the absence of the physical presence of Jesus. And so it's a theme in the Gospel of John that you don't have in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because they haven't lived, they're living in a more immediately close time to the life of Jesus. By the time you get to the writing of the Gospel of John, the church has lived without the physical presence of Jesus for generations. And so a lot of the Last Supper discourse has to do with how are we going to live in the world in the Spirit, but without Jesus there with us. But he's also saying, he says, I'm going away, but I'm going to come back. It's good that I go away. He says that elsewhere. But where he is going is through death, through suffering, through loss. And as one modern theologian who I'm very fond of, James Allison, says, what he's doing is he is taking something that we view as toxic, as poisonous, as deadly, death. We don't like it. We don't like to think about it. We don't like to think about our own death or the deaths of those we love. And what Jesus is saying is he's going not around this, not over it. He's not skipping it. He is going through it to make it a safe place for us. This coming out of Johannine literature, I think we can hold on to that. It's not saying we can't use it for our own thing, but he's talking about something else, as the revelation is, which is, that those who die faithfully are not lost. They die in the Lord, and they will rest from their labor. Okay. And so we have a little interjection here, another character presented. Then I looked, and there was a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was one like the Son of Man, with a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. Another angel came out of the temple. This is the fourth one there. I think this is the third. Calling out with a loud voice to the one who sat on the cloud, use your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth is fully ripe. So the one who sat on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped. Well, wrong way. Okay. One of the things to deal with right away, and translations tend to do this, the one seated on the cloud was like the Son of Man. Thought I had a slide on this with the Greek, but it really, in the Greek, it just says like a Son of Man. And by capitalizing son and man and putting the definite article, they're putting it in the context of how Jesus talks in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But the image of one like a Son of Man, and the Greek could be read either way, comes out of the book of Daniel. And it is an Old Testament image. When God talks to Ezekiel, he regularly says, Son of Man. And Son of Man, what's a Son of Man? It's a man. It becomes an apocalyptic image because of Daniel, but we're in here, we are obviously looking at Jesus in this apocalyptic setting, the Lamb, but since it's probably, with some imagery we're going to look at referring back to Daniel, it is more likely to be one like a Son of Man. That means you've got this divine figure, but it looks like a guy. So back in Daniel, as I watched, thrones were set in place, and an ancient one took his throne. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. And we've got him in this great heavenly court, stream of fire issued and flowed out from his presence. We're going to get back to fire in a minute. And then immediately after that, as I watched in the night visions, as I dreamed, I saw one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. And he came to the Ancient One and was presented before him. And he gets dominion and glory and kingship and all peoples, languages, and nations, familiar language. And he's going to be an eternal king. That imagery is brought in here, but here, instead of coming on a cloud, you had the Ancient One seated on a throne, and here we have the one like a son of man seated on a cloud. An angel comes out of the temple. So we have a command from God coming out to tell the one like a son of man that the hour of judgment is here. Okay. All right. Yes. The image of these images of both cutting the grain and cutting the grapes kind of come out of the book of Joel. Let the nations rouse themselves and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat, one of the valleys in Jerusalem, for there I will sit to judge all the neighboring nations. Put in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Go in, tread, for the winepress is full. The vats overflow, for their wickedness is great. And so in Hebrew poetry, they rhymed ideas. So put in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. And then you rhyme that with tread, go in, tread, for the winepress is full. Two harvest images. If you look through the Psalms, you'll find that the first half and the second half of the verse often echo the same idea poetically. So you are building up ideas rather than sounds. And John takes this vision and sort of divides it. So the sickle is being used to bring in God's harvest that's going to be stored away, but the harvest of the grapes is the wrath of God. So the harvesting with the sickle is God's blessing, bringing his people into safety, those who die in the Lord. The grapes are the judgment of God. So use your sharp sickle. And this other angel who came out from the altar, the angel who has authority over fire. And in that vision in Daniel of the Ancient of Days, fire comes out from him. Remember also that the altar, and you know, we have candles on our altars, but ancient altars were made out of rock because they would build a fire on them. They'd stack wood on the altar so they could put the meat of the sacrifice on it to offer it to the god. So there's a connection between altars and fire that we don't have. And remember that under the altar were the martyrs, those who had died in the Lord, and they cried out for judgment, for justice. So this angel comes out and says, use your sharp sickle, gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for its grapes are ripe. So the angel swung his sickle over the earth and gathered the vintage of the earth and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. So we've got this image of judgment, and remember all of those biblical images that God's going to give people this wine to drink, and they will stagger, they'll be drunken, they'll be out of control. And the winepress was trodden outside of the city. And There's going to be a sense later on as we look at the coming end of the book that the holy city, the New Jerusalem, is going to be under siege from all of the forces of evil. So that's outside of the city. But also remember that outside of the city was where Jesus was crucified. And that what took place outside of the city was, in John's view, the moment of judgment, the moment of redemption, the moment of justification. All took place outside the walls of the city. And the blood flowed from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle for a distance of about 200 miles. What does 200 miles mean? 200 miles means nothing. In the original, it says for about 1,600 stadia. What's 1,600? It's 40 times 40. It's a big square. So he's saying everywhere. Well, there are the souls under the thing crying out. And remember that from the very beginning of the Bible, back to the original murder, Cain and Abel, the blood of the innocent cries out to God from the earth for judgment. And here's just a really powerful image out of Isaiah for the wrath of God as a winepress. Who is this so splendidly robed, marching in great might? It is I, announcing vindication, mighty to save. Why are your robes red and your garments like theirs who tread the winepress? And this is, I've trodden the winepress alone. No one helped me. I trod in my anger, my wrath. Their juice spattered on my garments and stained all my robes. For the day of vengeance was in my heart, and the year of my redeeming work had come. I looked, but there was no helper. I stared, but there was no one to sustain me. And there's that Hebrew poetry, no helper, no one to sustain me. So my arm brought me victory, and my wrath sustained me. I trampled down peoples in my anger. I crushed them in my wrath. And so this wine, this blood is of the wrath of God. And remember, the people who are reading this are people who are living lives downtrodden by injustice. Okay, and there goes the stadium. All right. And we still got everybody here. Any thoughts or ideas before we slide away?
Richard, I don't think I had ever really realized that wine was the wrath of God. That kind of like presents communion a little bit different, doesn't it? I mean,
well, maybe. It is also, we have in the Bible, we have other images for wine. There's a line in the Old Testament about wine to gladden men's hearts. So this is a theme. What?
And Jesus's first miracle that didn't
yes,
like
right.
at all.
Yeah, in the Gospel of John, so there's a celebratory aspect too. It's just that the connection of wine and blood does go back into the Old Testament. Just, and wine is referred to as the blood of grapes in the Bible because of just the color.
So when is all this happening?
What?
All of this wrath.
Yeah. Well,
destruction.
Yeah. Well, what he is, the when is, so, understand that all of this was written 2,000 years ago, or 1900, well, close to 2000 now, but at any rate, and people have been trying to assign a date to it ever since.
Right, the apocalypse, right?
Right. And so I don't think, you know, that there's an app for that. Where you know, actually, I imagine there's probably somebody who's going to come up with an app that's going to predict the apocalypse. There's an app for everything, but I don't think there's an
What do you
accurate.
think? Do you think
What?
it is about an apocalypse, or do you think it's something else?
Well, I think that we, you know, going with Jesus or with John in the Gospels and the idea of what scholars call a realized apocalypse. You know, and when Jesus in the middle of the gospel says, now is the judgment of the world, that's that realized apocalypse. I think the apocalypse is happening all the time. That if you look at it the right way, the world is always ending. The world is always under judgment. You know, some people say that, you know, who had invested big amounts of money in Silicon Valley Bank might well say, oh my God, the world has ended. Well, life's going to go on, but there is a judgment there. There is a judgment in looking at people's behaviors and what they do. I would be surprised, you know, maybe pleasantly so, with the ultimate outcome of an apocalypse. But I think that the more useful thing, rather than doing something that throws our thoughts about life into some future state, you know, in my old evangelical days, people would say he's so heavenly minded, he's no earthly good. And they had a thing in old evangelical days they called kingdom sickness. Oh, I just want to die and go home and be with Jesus. And so you can focus on what's out here and never be alive in the moment, which is the moment when we're living. But, you know, our plans are always under judgment. Our lives are always under a kind of judgment. But we're also always trusting in redemption and trusting in the care of God. So I think that viewing it as a metaphor, at least for right now, is probably more helpful than wondering if, you know, Benjamin Netanyahu is going to let them rebuild the temple so that Jesus can come back. Have you ever seen the movie Time Bandits?
Mm-mm.
Okay, well, it was written by George Harrison and filmed by one of the Monty Python guys. And it's got this, and it's got this whole thing that when the Supreme Being created the world, he did it in a bit of a rush. And so there's some holes in it. And there's a group of dwarves who were involved in the making of creation, and they have a map of the holes that allows them to go to different times. And they pick up this little boy on the way, and he goes on their adventures. Well, at the end, when everything is falling apart because of all their machinations, the Supreme Being shows up. And the Supreme Being is this elderly British character actor, overweight, in a Bond Street's, you know, bespoke suit. And he's walking around going, oh, terribly sorry to be so late. Had so much to do. And the great line from it is when they discover that he knew all along what they were doing, the dwarves are all surprised. And he says, well, I am the Supreme Being after all. Not exactly dim, you know. But I think that there is much for us to learn from the faith of this first century community that doesn't necessarily have to do with what's going to happen in world events in the next 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years.
I guess Ukraine is living in an apocalypse right now.
Yeah, right. Well, and the other side is that there is a kind of judgment going on in that here you have this superpower or remnant superpower that can't seem, you know, to wipe out this smaller country over here and do their will. But yeah. We live with apocalypses all the time. There was a year in my life where the great patriarch of our family, my great grandfather, died. That was not unexpected. A couple of months later, my father died. A few weeks later, his father died, and a couple of months after that, a grandmother on the other side died. So you
Wow.
had all these family systems that were kind of blown up. And my oldest cousin, who died last year, we used to refer to that as the apocalypse, because there was a kind of ending of a world. Okay, well, we will see you next week. I will say that the first week in April is Holy Week, and I will be out at Plantation Village doing a Holy Week service on Wednesday at this time. So the first week of April, we will not have class, but we'll be back the following. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Have a good one. Thank you, Richard.
Bye-bye.